Hello, welcome to the teaching portion of Anthem Online. My name is Bert Alcorn. I'm the lead pastor here at Anthem Ventura. Once again, so delighted you are spending some of your day with us today. If you are new, newish, or need a bit of a refresher, we are in the middle of a study through the book of Daniel. And Daniel is this Old Testament prophet. One maybe we skip over, or better yet, this is probably what we do, is especially if you have some relationship or context in the church, is there's a couple of like really well-known Sunday school stories, and then we skip over all the really weird stuff. And so I don't know about you, but this book has really been like a gift to me, a gift I believe to us as a church. I have been so incredibly grateful for the book of Daniel over these past 2 months that we found ourselves in. I'm impressed with the way that God shapes history and being a part of this history shaping movement with God, like we are right now, makes me just ask this question, like, God, what are you up to? What do you have for us? What is happening? And I think right now, at least maybe you're catching me on a particular moment of prophetic curiosity. God, what are you up to? Clearly you are up to something. Clearly things will not ever go back to the way they were, and whatever normal looks like is going to be quite different. What are you on about? And Daniel so far has been all about how to live well, wisely, and wholly in exile, when you are not in your home, when you're in a home that's not your home, when you're in a culturally coercive empire that does not share our view of the world. And the story of Daniel really does motivate faithfulness despite exile, or even because of exile in Babylon. And Daniel's visions offer hope that God will bring all nations under his rule, that he is control, that kings and kingdoms will come and go, but God is forever. And I think those messages are coming in loud and clear for us as a community. And so far, Daniel and his friends have been dragged off into exile. They are the spoils of war. They're in Babylon, the largest empire the world has ever known at that point. They're being indoctrinated, enculturated, and challenged to hold their value system, their beliefs, and they are tempted to leave it all behind for the easy, comfortable, and safe options of conforming to this empire. Now, we've touched on a number of different really profound themes so far in the book of Daniel. We've touched on things like non-participation. When the world is going one way, we are guided by our faithfulness and value in the kingdom of God. We've talked about the necessity of humility and obedience and the dangers of pride and the invaluable posture of faithfulness over the long haul. Daniel has been an incredibly profound, relevant, and even prophetic for our time and our place that we find ourselves in today. Now, I give some of that background because what's about to happen is two things. One is we're about to embark on another well-worn story from Daniel. And I don't want familiarity to breed contempt. I don't want the Sunday school flannel graph nature of this story to rob from the value and the things that God wants to teach us. But also after this week, we're going to get into some really weird stuff in Daniel. And so I want us to keep our kind of big picture, keep our context for where we're going so we don't get lost in the visions and the dreams and the beast or the lion's den and the fiery furnace. Okay, so today we're in Daniel chapter 6. So a word of warning and danger. This is another Sunday school kid story, and the warning, it is very much not a Sunday school kid story, okay? I just read this story the other day to my kiddos out of the Jesus Storybook Bible, and as I'm reading, I'm kind of second guessing like whether or not I want to wait to read this story with them. Like they can watch the Star Wars films with me, but I'm not sure about some of these Bible stories here, but I think what we're going to find out today is this is another moment of a crazy, corrupt, power-hungry maniac, and another empire that does not follow the way of God and the worldly consequences for godly faithfulness. So let's read Daniel chapter 6, starting in verse 1. It pleased Darius to set over the kingdom 120 satraps to be throughout the whole kingdom. Stop right there. Now, a little background here. This story takes place maybe 60 or so years after chapter 1. So Daniel, by now, he's an old man, kind of like our story last time. He's an old man. And Daniel 5 and 6 kind of go right together chronologically. So Daniel 5 happens, then Daniel 6 is. And Daniel is upwards of like 80 or 90 years old at this point. And by this time in the Babylonian Empire had been conquered by the Medo-Persian Empire. That's where we left off in Daniel chapter 5, right? With King Belshazzar, and he dies, and the Medo-Persians come and conquer, and Darius is now the king. And this brand new empire is now the largest empire that the world had ever known up until this day, stretching from Egypt in the south and the west up to modern day Russia in the north, and then as far east as the Indus River in what is now Pakistan. So huge, huge, huge empire. So it's this wide, expansive kingdom, and it pleased Darius, that's the new king here, right? So 3 chapters in a row is 3 new kings. We have 3 king, the changeover in kings, and what we see is the constant is Daniel in these empire changeovers, these kingship changeovers from Nebuchadnezzar to Belshazzar, and now to Darius. Daniel is the constant here. And he appoints these satraps. It's kind of like a governor over the entire empire. So it's a governmental type position. Verse 2. And over them 3 high officials, of whom Daniel was one. This is interesting. To whom these satraps would give an account, so that the king might suffer no loss. So it's a MLM situation, right? You got the king, you got the 3 officials, 120 satraps, right? Little triangle situation. Then this Daniel became distinguished above all the other high officials and satraps, because an excellent spirit was in him. And we know that to be the Spirit of God, or in the language of Daniel, the God of the Most High. And the king planned to set him over the whole kingdom. He was due for a sweet promotion. So here's Daniel, maybe 80, 90 years old, and not only has he lived through 2 kingdoms and at least 3 to 4 kings, depending on how you count, but he's still at it and better than ever at his job. To the point where the king says, okay, dude, you're amazing. I want you to run my kingdom. I'm gonna take some time off here. I can just chill or whatever a king does in his spare time. You take it on. You seem like you're doing a great job. But Daniel's proven time and time again that not only he's someone that can be trusted, but that Yahweh's spirit is in him, and Yahweh is powerful and puts all these other gods and kingdoms to shame. And Daniel, as we talked about last week, has lived out this idea of long obedience in the same direction, demonstrating just this incredible depth of faithfulness and diligence over the years. And he has come to a position of power and influence because of that faithfulness in God. And that faithfulness and simple living continually poured, to use the language of the Bible, poured heaps of burning coals on the heads of those who didn't follow God, and led to immense jealousy. See what happens here starting in verse 4. Then the high officials, the other guys that he got promoted over, and the satraps, the guys who were supposed to be under him anyway, sought to find a ground for complaint against Daniel with regard to the kingdom, but they could find no ground for complaint or any fault, because he was faithful and no error or fault was found in him. Then these men said, we shall not find any ground for complaint against this Daniel unless we find it in connection with the law of his God. So very similar, if you remember the story from Daniel chapter 3 with Shadrach, Meshach, Abednego. Daniel's co-workers here, we assume, are jealous. This is office politics again, and they're angry. And they say, here's a Hebrew who's now number 2 over the entire empire and the entire kingdom. He's not even a Persian in this case. And so Daniel lived, as far as we can tell, a simple life of service to God and to whatever king happened to be in power, from Nebuchadnezzar to Belshazzar to now Darius or Cyrus. And he fulfilled Jeremiah's prophecy. Remember, we started with that prophecy of Jeremiah all the way back at the beginning of our kickoff of this series, to seek the welfare of the city where God has sent him into exile, and to pray to the Lord on its behalf. For in its welfare, you will find your welfare. Daniel is fulfilling that prophecy from Jeremiah. He's seeking the welfare of that nation. He's praying for it. And in its welfare comes Daniel's welfare. And this challenge with quiet, faithful, diligent excellence is that it typically creates enemies, right? We live We live in a world that is very much built on an economy of evil. That's not saying that the economy is evil. It's saying that in our world is built on the underlying evils of greed and self-service and ambition and success and accomplishment and fame and influence. And the world doesn't know what to do with people who live out God's character and his qualities and still find success in this world. The world doesn't know what to do with those people who are not like pumping up their Instagram page to get more followers or jumping on top of everyone at work to get that promotion. The world doesn't know what to do with just faithful, quiet, humble people who are being blessed by God. They don't know how to play the game against people who don't play the game. So the other leaders of Babylon started working to get him out of power because Daniel was not playing the game and he was still being blessed and elevated. How can such an economy function with like a wrench in the system, to have a Hebrew, to have someone of God leading the entire empire? And if the world is built on finding dirt on people and using that as leverage to get ahead, it falls apart when a person lives with integrity and faithfulness. So they put a plan into works to make his faith and integrity work against him. The one thing that's actually keeping him in power and blessing him, they're going to go after and attack. It's easy to be successful against faithful, humble people. In a sense, they're suckers. They generally fall for the traps that evil people want to lay for them. And also, they're predictable. Daniel, in one sense, for these other officials, was a bit of a sucker. He wasn't going to play the game. He was easy prey for the evil other leaders of Babylon. So they came up with this plan to kind of entrap Daniel. But watch what happens. It's really just fantastic. They're out to get him. He is this humble, quiet, predictable man who has these regular rhythms of prayer and worship around these eating laws about how he leads. He's faithful, he's humble, he's not trying to accumulate power. And someone like that might be easy to trap. But notice that's not the end of the story. Verse 6, then these high officials and satraps came by agreement to the king. They all come. They say, we got this plan together. And they said to him, O King Darius, live forever. All the high officials of the kingdom, the prefects and the satraps, the counselors and the governments, another way of saying like everyone's on board, are agreed that the king should establish an ordinance and enforce an injunction that whoever makes petition to any god or man for 30 days, except to you, O king, shall be cast into the den of lions. The den of lions was like another really common thing to have in an empire in this time. So you got the fiery furnace, the den of lions. This is not out of character for an empire in this time, in this place. Now, O king, establish the injunction and sign the document. This is getting real political technical here. So that it cannot be changed according to the law of the Medes and the Persians, which cannot be revoked. So apparently, Darius, king, is some sort of constitutional monarch where there's even rules up against the king. So Belshazzar, Nebuchadnezzar, they're dictators, they're kings, they can do anything they want. But apparently this guy has to follow some rules. Therefore, King Darius signed the document, an injunction. They appeal to the king's vanity. Did you guys catch that? They appeal to his vanity. It's actually kind of a brilliant idea. Obviously not from like a spiritual standpoint, but from a political standpoint. It's a way for the king to consolidate power over his brand new kingdom. But we know that's going to be a death sentence for Daniel. But in spite of that, watch what happens here. Verse 10, when Daniel knew that the document had been signed, he went to his house where he had windows in his upper chamber open towards Jerusalem. He got down on his knees 3 times a day and prayed and gave thanks before his God, just as he had done previously. He knows this is a death sentence for him, and he keeps on going. Nothing in his life, all these external circumstances, nothing will disrupt his spiritual practices. Nothing. Not the distraction, not the threat of death will disrupt the rhythms he has with God. Now this story, unlike chapter 1, if you remember all the way back to that chapter, which was about compromise, this story is not about a sin Daniel will not commit. So chapter 1 was about, the sins that Daniel and his friends might commit and being enculturated into this new empire, specifically around some of these food laws and stuff. And so that's not what this is about. This is not about a sin Daniel might or might not commit, but a practice that he will not omit. This is not about a sin Daniel will not commit. It's about a practice he will not omit. And if you think about it, it actually would have been really easy for Daniel to just go on the lowdown with this one, or to stop this a little bit. It would have been really easy. I mean, imagine if you're Daniel, it would have been super easy to just guys, I'm just gonna take the month off. God, you're gonna understand here. I don't want to die. I'm just gonna take the month off from this one. I mean, man, dude, you're 80, 90 years old. You've been faithful. You've been doing this the whole time. You deserve a month off, right? Or even not even a month off, but I'm gonna pray downstairs with those windows closed, just to be on the safe side. I don't want to attract any unwarranted attention here. You don't have to murder anyone or blaspheme. Just take a month off, right? But he didn't. He didn't take a month off. He didn't pray in his closet, go kind of mumble his prayer under his breath. He knelt down, the open windows in the upper chamber 3 times a day to pray. Apparently, this was a huge deal to Daniel to stand his ground. It was worth dying for in order to live out his faith, not only in private, but in public. That's just, man, wow. That's just really inspiring to me, honestly. Now watch what happens, verse 11. Then these men came by agreement and found Daniel making petition and plea before his God, doing his thing, right? Then they came near and said before the king concerning the injunction, "O king, did you not sign an injunction that anyone who makes petition to any god or man within 30 days, except to you, O king, shall be cast into the den of lions?" Obviously, the answer is yes. The king answered and said that the thing stands fast according to the law of the Medes and Persians, which cannot be revoked. Then they answered and said before the king, "Daniel, who is one of the exiles from Judah, pays no attention to you, O king, or the injunction you have signed, but makes his petition 3 times a day." Then the king, when he heard these words, was much distressed and set his mind to deliver Daniel. And he labored till the sun went down to rescue him. Then these men came by agreement to the king and said to the king, "Know, O king, that it is the law of the Medes and the Persians that no injunction or ordinance that the king establishes can be changed." Apparently, the king is trapped and can't do anything about it. And Daniel's faithfulness here ends up with him with the punishment, the consequence. Now, there are a few interesting points leading up to this. The first is that Daniel fulfilled boldly all the really predictable elements of his faithfulness. He didn't start to hide his prayers. He didn't change up the times. He didn't go downstairs and adjust his prayer schedule and do it in quiet so as to not be caught. He opened his windows and continued to practice just as publicly as did before. Daniel was happy to defy an order that clearly violated the nature of his relationship with God. And this is, honestly, this has been a really interesting and strange question to think about in our time and our place. If the context of not being able to meet together as the church because the government is telling us we can't do that, this presents a really interesting parallel here, potentially, if we can take this the wrong way here. Now, we know the church is not a building and the church is gathered in all sorts of different contexts. But I think there is a danger for us to misconstrue the moment we are in for the moment Daniel is in. Yeah, you're not going to be put to death for praying. You're not going to be put to death for worshiping. Now, this context is a little bit different because the government is not telling us that we can't worship God. We can't pray. The government is telling us we can't meet in large groups because we might get sick or others might get sick. And that's no problem because the church has always adapted to a myriad of contexts over time. But it is an interesting moment that we find ourselves in, is with the change up, with not being able to meet and process through our normal rhythms of church. What are the things we're going to give up and what are we going to hold on to? Meaning, just because we can't meet together as a church, are we just going to throw our spiritual practices out the window? Are we going to throw the value and importance of community out the window, or the value and importance of mission and evangelism and generosity out the window just because this one thing was disrupted? Or are we going to, like Daniel, hold faithful to these things that are vital to our relationship with Jesus? No matter what the context, no matter what our external circumstances are, and no matter how the church has to shape and change and mold and be agile to meet this moment, will we stay committed to the mission of Jesus amidst the changing circumstances? Daniel took his stand as an 80, 90-year-old dude by pressing on with his regular prayer life and making sure the world around him knew that God is God, and no king can ever stand up and say that God is second tier, that God somehow doesn't deserve our first and our best. What does that look like in the time and place that we find ourselves right now, where the convenience and rhythms of typical church life have been removed? Are we still demonstrating with our lives that God is God, that he will not be second tier, that he actually deserves our all and our best no matter the context? Verse 16, then the king commanded, and Daniel was brought and cast into the den of lions. So his faithfulness gets the worldly consequence. The king declared to Daniel, may your God, whom you serve continually, deliver you. And a stone was brought and laid on the mouth of the den, and the king sealed it with his own signet and with the signet of his lords, that nothing might be changed concerning Daniel. Then the king went to his palace and spent the night fasting. No diversions were brought to him. We know what that means. And sleep fled from him. Verse 19, at the break of day, the king arose and went in haste to the den of lions. And as he came near to the den where Daniel was, he cried out in a tone of anguish. And the king declared to Daniel, O Daniel, servant of the living God, has your God, whom you serve continually, been able to deliver you from the lions? This is a really interesting question we're going to get to in just a second. Why would he even bother checking? Why would he rush the next day to go check and make sure Daniel is alive? It's not quite what you think it is. We'll get there in a second. Then Daniel said to the king, O king, live forever. My God sent his angels and shut the lion's mouth, and they have not harmed me, because I was found blameless before him. And also before you, O king, I have done no harm. Then the king was exceedingly glad. He was rooting for Daniel the whole time, and commanded that Daniel be taken up out of the den. So Daniel was taken up out of the den, and no kind of harm was found on him, because he had trusted in his God. Now we might be thinking, wait a second, what about the decree? Like, what happened? The rule was if you prayed to someone other than Darius, you had to be thrown into the lion's den. Why is he getting busted out of jail here? It's the whole reason he's there in the first place. Is the king suddenly breaking his decree? Well, this is why the king was so quick and excited to go run to the cave and see if Daniel was okay. Because there was this ancient legal custom called innocence by ordeal, where, long story short, if a defendant's guilt was at all in question, they would put him through some kind of test of fire, for example, in chapter 3, or maybe poison. And right here, it's the lion's den, right? The most common was like a water ordeal, where you'd be put in a life or death situation, say throw you into the middle of the river, and if you made it out, it was a sign that God or the gods had somehow cleared your name and you were innocent. And if you died, you were guilty. And it's sort of like saying, we can't really make the decision, we're gonna let this river make the decision for us. Or we can't really make the decision on this man's innocence or guilt, we're gonna let the lions do our work for us. So our legal system has come a long way, right? So when Daniel is there, awake and alive the next morning, that to an ancient Near Easterner would have been a sign that, like, oh my gosh, God cleared his name, or the gods have smiled upon this person and he is innocent. God cleared his name. He's not guilty. And so yet again, and this is why the king went in haste to go see, had God delivered him? And yet again, we see this backdrop in the book of Daniel, that the wickedness of the world around us provides an opportunity for believers to stand in contrast and to actually live out a different way. Daniel's faithfulness provides such a stark contrast to the actions of the other leaders. And Darius can't help but keep Daniel in charge and throw everyone else in the lion's den. This is verse 24. And the king commanded, and those men who had maliciously accused Daniel were brought and cast into the den of lions. They, their children, and their wives, and before they reached the bottom of the den, the lions overpowered them and broke all their bones in pieces. So this is obviously like just an ancient, barbaric, violent time in history that is appalling to us now. Verse 25, then King Darius wrote to all the peoples and nations and languages that dwell on the earth. This is a letter that goes out to everybody. Kind of same thing as King Nebuchadnezzar, right? The letter goes out to everybody in the known world. And the letter goes out like this: peace be multiplied to you. I make a decree that in all my royal dominion, people are to tremble and fear before the God of Daniel. For he is the living God, enduring forever. His kingdom shall never be destroyed, and his dominion shall be to the end. He delivers and rescues. He works signs and wonders in heaven and on earth. He who has saved Daniel from the power of the lions. Now, there's a couple really important things about this narrative right here. The first is Daniel's life, in worldly terms, produced almost no faithfulness or fruitfulness, almost no fruitfulness in worldly terms. Meaning he survived multiple generations and each one found a way to reject Yahweh in their own special, unique context. He didn't really get to see any revival or even a return to Jerusalem. Honestly, we see these amazing moments of Daniel, of faithfulness, but he's also just kind of there in the story of God. And it really seems like his people are still in exile. They're still in captivity. First Babylon, now the Medes and the Persians take them over, and they're still in slavery and exile. They're still not in their homeland. We have to be thinking like, yeah, Daniel's been faithful. He's been obedient, but like God's people are still in exile. Well, what's the point? What's going on? Which brings us to the second thing we see in Daniel is that his faithfulness produced some amazing things in the larger narrative of God that he doesn't get to see. And this last line in Daniel chapter 6 is particularly important. Verse 28. So this Daniel prospered during the reign of Darius and the reign of Cyrus the Persian, which we think is the same person. Kings had a bunch of different names in that time, but we think Darius, Cyrus, same person. Darius might have been the Mede, Cyrus the Persian, kind of same name for the same person, or different names for the same person. Now, why is that line important? Because Daniel's faithfulness and obedience amidst intense cultural coercion and proper persecution yielded world-changing implications beyond his own life and his own scope. He was more concerned with obeying God and being faithful than getting credit or seeing God answer those big unanswered questions in his lifetime. Yeah, he was elevated to a position of influence, he prospered, but his people were still in exile. And the larger grand narrative of the Old Testament, where God's people are led by, they leave Egypt, they're delivered out of Egypt, and they wander around in the desert, and they finally get their homeland, and then they have all these judges, and some of them are good, some of them are not, and they demand a king, and they get a king, and Saul was not so good, and David was the best king they had, but he was still a murderer and adulterer, and the kingdom is split, and they have all these different kings, and they finally get conquered by the Assyrians, and then the Babylonians, and then the Medes, Persians conquer them, and they're still in exile, and it seems like God's promises have still not been fulfilled for the people of God. And we find Daniel in the midst of that story, and his faithfulness had implications beyond his own life in the greater narrative of what God was doing in his people. Because he was faithful and obedient, God used him in the larger story. This is amazing. Towards the end of the Old Testament, chronologically, is Ezra and Nehemiah, right? So the books are a little bit jumbled in order. They're not really in chronological order, but that's kind of the end of the historical accounts. And it's some of the last history before the break of 400 or so years of silence, and then when the New Testament kicks up again. And the book of Ezra starts like this. And so I'll read the last line of that Daniel chapter, and then I'm going to read Ezra. Daniel 6:28. So this Daniel prospered during the reign of Darius and the reign of Cyrus the Persian. And Ezra 1 verse 1 starts like this. In the first year of Cyrus, king of Persia, that the word of the Lord by the mouth of Jeremiah might be fulfilled, the Lord stirred up the spirit of Cyrus, king of Persia, so that he made a proclamation throughout all his kingdom and also put it in writing. Thus says Cyrus, king of Persia, the Lord, the God of heaven, has given me all the kingdoms of the earth, and he has charged me to build him a house at Jerusalem, which is in Judah. Whoever is among you, all his people, may his God be with him. And let him go to Jerusalem, which is in Judah, and rebuild the house of the Lord. It's capital L-O-R-D, so Yahweh, the God of Israel. He is the God who is in Jerusalem. If you missed what happened, Daniel's faithfulness, this is the same king in Ezra 1 and Daniel chapter 6. Daniel's faithfulness paved the way for Cyrus to know Yahweh and to open the door for the return of the Israelites to Jerusalem. That sends the story rocketing towards Jesus the Messiah being born in Bethlehem. This is astounding. Daniel's faithfulness and obedience all the way at the end of his life prompts the king to not only worship the God of Israel and to send this letter out to the known world, but to allow the people of God to return to the promised land and set the stage for Jesus the Christ, who would come hundreds of years later. This is beautiful. Here's why it's not beautiful. Because you and I love instant gratification. We love to be praised and honored. We love to get the credit. We love to see the results of our work. We love to plant the seed and reap the harvest. And the question that each of us has to ask is whether we are content to be a part of the bigger story that may even go beyond our physical lives, or if we are living a life that demands the credit for our own labor. Can you live your life of faithfulness without knowing if it was fruitful or not? And not fruitful like you're growing into the Lord, but can you live a life of faithfulness and maybe not see the external results in this world? Can you live a diligent life without seeing the payoff of people coming to Jesus? What if we had the kind of long view that Daniel did? That you may be part of a story of revival, and I actually believe there's something happening right now in our time and place that we are privileged to be a part of in this new move of God. You may be a part of a story of repentance. You may lead people to Jesus. You may not. And for the people of God, that has to be okay, because we are part of a much bigger story than our own life. One of the things that Daniel teaches us is that the fruit of the Christian life is being the people of God. And the fruit is God's to determine and distribute. We are responsible for obedience. God is responsible for outcomes. I love the line that Paul has, I planted, Apollos watered, but God gave the growth. It speaks to the fact that we have role, responsibility, obedience here and now. We walk in faithfulness, but it's God. It's on God to determine the results. Even as we think about the church, and in this really unique time we find in the life of the church, Jesus reminds us in Matthew 16, I will build my church. Our place is to honor God, live faithfully, and trust that He will use our stories to advance His kingdom. I love this line in the book of Hebrews, chapter 6, 11, verse 11 or so. The writer of Hebrews says, and we desire each one of you to show the same earnestness, to have the same full assurance of hope until the end, so that you may not be sluggish, but imitators of those who through faith and patience inherit the promises. Imitate those who through faith and patience inherit the promises. That word faith in Greek is pistis, and in Hebrew it can also be translated as faithfulness. And so to have faith is to be faithful. One and the same. Faithful in all the dimensions of your life. Faithful to God to stay true, to not get sucked into compromise, to not assimilate into our city that we love, but it is like a siren drawing us into its own worldviews and value systems. Faithfulness to your community, to your spouse, to your kids, your family, to those that you're in relationship with. Faithfulness to your church. Faithfulness to God's calling on your life to maybe just stay where He has you. Friends, do not underestimate the power of a quiet, faithful life and service to God. In the book of Daniel, it had world-shattering implications. What might God have in store for you if you were okay not taking the credit, not seeing the fruit, not getting the payoff, not getting the honor, but instead saying, regardless, I'm going to honor God and stay faithful to what He has for me? I wonder what God would do with a whole church of people saying, I don't need the credit, I just want to live faithfully. What could God do? Let me pray for you. Father, I'm deeply humbled by this moment that we are in right now, both in culture and as a church in the book of Daniel, chapter 6. I'm ever aware of the ways we are falling short, where even our model and mode of church is being so challenged. I'm even asking the question, how do we faithful as a church without seeing the visible fruit of being able to gather together? How do we know we're doing what we're supposed to be doing? And I just sense this call to remain faithful and obedient to what you've laid out for us in your scriptures, to what you have given us as mandate for a church. And even though we may not be able to see the visible fruit, our responsibility is to be humble and obedient. You are responsible for the outcome. I wonder with intense curiosity, God, how you would use us as a church if we were less concerned with external validation and more concerned with faithful obedience. God, would you produce in us a joy and a readiness to honor you and to be faithful, even if we don't get to see the fruit, even if we don't get the credit. God, we want to be used in your larger story. So we're saying, me personally, you a representative of our church, God, we're saying, here we are, use us however you will to further your kingdom in Ventura as it is in heaven. In Jesus' name, amen.